So right when I was fresh out of college, I managed to land myself a job with an engineering firm over in Pennsylvania. It kind of sucked having to move away from Rochester, New York, where all my friends and family were, but the salary this firm was offering was so sweet that I just couldn't turn it down. So I went online and got looking for apartments just outside of Philly, eventually finding an advert for a guy who was looking for a roommate for a super swanky apartment. I mean, this place was really nice, and I could get why the guy would be looking for a roommate to split the rent with, especially since he seemed to be a younger dude who was probably in a similar position as I was. However, I didn't have the time to drive down to actually look at the place or meet the guy in person, so I pretty much did all the arrangements by phone, which maybe, now that I look back on it, was my first big mistake. So I moved in with this guy, Daryl, who was super chill and pretty much spent all day playing 2K since he worked nights. I figured that he must have had a pretty high-paying job, and since he had this huge flat-screen TV, lots of expensive clothes, a nice car, the works, really. We didn't talk all that much, since we were on such different schedules, but eventually, when I asked him exactly what it is that he did for a living, he gave some super vague answer about having some kind of accountancy job. And no matter how much I pressed him for details, he always gave some wishy-washy answer until he got tired of the questions and changed the subject. Like a lot of you reading this, I started to suspect that Daryl wasn't quite telling the truth about what he did for a living. Like not once did I see him wearing anything like a shirt and tie. All his clothes were super upmarket, sure, but they were all super casual. He also had a lot of visitors in the evenings before we left for work. At first, I figured they were just friends of his, but there were a handful he didn't seem all that close with. And every time they stopped by to see him, at some point they just scuffle off into Daryl's bedroom for a while, talking in hushed tones before the visitor eventually left. I knew something was going on, but as embarrassing as it is, back then I was pretty naive. Besides that, I really didn't think it was any of my business. The last thing I wanted to do was upset my new roommate and screw away such a sweet living arrangement. So, this one Saturday, I'm in the local 7-Eleven just like a block away from the apartment when this dude comes up to me as I'm looking at coffee and asks me if I'm the guy who lives with Daryl. Obviously, I'm all like, yeah, good to see you, dude. I didn't recognize the guy, but I figured that he'd visited the apartment one time and I just couldn't quite remember his face. He's being all friendly and whatnot, making small talk about this and that before he asked if I know whether or not Daryl was at home right then. I told him I didn't know, but that since it was like mid-afternoon that he probably was since he worked nights, whatever that entailed. And the guy's all like, okay, cool, I might stop by and say hi. And all this stuff, then makes some excuses and leaves the store. I pick up a few things and head back to the apartment, half expecting to see the guy from the 7-Eleven when I walk through the door. Only he's not there, and when I tell Daryl about how I saw one of his buddies in the store, he has no idea who I'm talking about. Even when I describe the guy in quite vivid detail, he has absolutely zero clue who I'm referring to. He starts reeling off names, asking if it was Deshaun or Robbie or Angelo, and it's then that I sort of realize that the guy hadn't given me a name at all. Which is weird, right? I mean, I thought it was. You think the dude would have been like, tell him such and such said hi, or at least something like that. I didn't really think anything of it at the time, but Daryl seemed just a little too freaked out by the encounter for my liking. And in the moments after I told him, he marches off into his bedroom and stays there for the rest of the evening, talking to someone, I'm guessing on the phone, in those same hushed tones that I was used to hearing. A few days after this, I'm walking back up towards the 7-Eleven to grab some milk for coffee when I see the same dude that hadn't given his name parked up at the side of the road. He calls out to me, greeting me and making chit-chat in that same warm way he had before again asking if Daryl was home. This time I straight up lie to him, telling him that, yeah, Daryl was home, only this time he was with a bunch of his friends playing 2K. He wasn't. He was actually out visiting family across the city, but there was something about this guy that I really didn't like. I quickly make an excuse telling him I had to go, and it was only then that this guy's demeanor started to change. He wasn't all smiles and laughs anymore. He just eyeballed me as I walked away, and he was still there when I walked back, just watching me as I walked towards our apartment. I should have seen it coming, and I feel like such an idiot for not knowing what I was headed for. But I guess in hindsight, it's always 2020. Because a couple of nights later, I was just about to catch some sleep when Daryl finally comes home from work. He seems a little shaken and asks me if anyone had called by the apartment that evening. I tell him no, it's been pretty quiet, but the answer doesn't satisfy him. He asks me if I've seen anyone at all, anyone hanging around the area that I didn't recognize. I'd already told him about the second encounter that I'd had with the 7-Eleven guy, and this time it had creeped him out even more. He asked if I'd seen that same guy at any point that evening, and I told him no, that I hadn't seen him since that weekday evening. I turned the whole thing around and asked him why he was so nervous about this, if anything had happened at work that evening, but he was his usual cagey self. He just retreated to his bedroom where he apparently went straight to sleep, which is exactly what I did too. Next thing I know, I'm waking up to this loud banging on the front door to our apartment. I had pretty much knew exactly what the deal was. Daryl had gone out to make a call, as he sometimes did at this time of night, and had left his keys in the apartment. This had happened a handful of times before, and I was honestly getting really sick of being woken up by it. I'd suggested he actually put his car keys and apartment keys on the same key ring, but nope, apparently that meant if he lost one set, he lost both, which maybe was quite a smart idea in the long run, but that's beside the point. So I'm all bleary-eyed, shuffling toward the front door in my underwear and a t-shirt when he starts banging again. I'm like, all right, I'm coming. Stop with the banging, Jesus. Before I undo the deadbolts and open the door, I start saying something like, you really should just attach those freaking keys, when I see it's not Daryl at all. In fact, I have no idea who the guy at the door is, because he's wearing a freaking ski mask, and I have absolutely not the time or will to ask him, nor the other two idiots that he's with, because as soon as I open the door, he points a gun in my face, and then frog marches me back inside the apartment before locking the door behind them. The ski mask guy makes me kneel on the floor in the TV room and whispers to me that if I shout or anything, he's going to blow my brains out. I was absolutely terrified. I mean, more scared than I've ever been in my entire life. I had these uncontrollable shakes, like I had trouble just holding my head up. It was more comfortable for me to just rest my chin against my chest and pray that it'd all be over soon. This had a dual purpose too, because the last thing I saw before I did so and shut my eyes tight was one of the guys placing an empty plastic bottle of the muzzle on his pistol. Naive over something I was, yes, but I knew enough to know that this was some kind of ad hoc way to silence a shot. I didn't want to see what happened next, and I'm glad I didn't, because they burst into Daryl's room, and I heard the pop of that pistol as they shot him. I thought he was dead for a few minutes, like I was convinced that they just straight up executed him right there in his bed. And that was until they dragged him out of the bedroom, bleeding and cursing, and threw him down on the TV room floor a few meters away from me. The one guy kept his gun to the back of my head while they pretty much tortured Daryl right there in the TV room. One guy stamped on the bullet wound that he had, leaning on it with his sneaker, while the other forced his face into a couch cushion to muffle the screams. I mean, it was all obviously horrible what they were doing, and that was disturbing enough. But what really got me was how they seemed to enjoy the whole thing, how they seemed to take an immense amount of personal pleasure in causing us both as much pain and distress as was physically possible. It was like hearing Darrow's cries of pain was the funniest joke they'd ever heard, how the sight of his blood was the most fascinating, satisfying thing they'd ever seen. And it was then that it all came out. Like I said, you might have guessed what the deal was by now, but I pretty much had no idea back then. I was just so young and dumb. Daryl was a drug dealer and this was a robbery. So they beat the life out of him until he finally spoke up and told them where he kept his money in his stash. But I mean, for a while there, I thought they might have gotten the wrong place. Daryl flat out denied knowing what they were talking about and insisted that they got in the wrong place and how there was nothing to find there. But in the end, he broke and told them. They then took to clearing him out, and from what he told me, after he'd been discharged from the hospital for a fairly superficial gunshot wound to the shoulder, they'd taken him for about $20,000 plus. I had to cover Daryl's rent for a few months until he was well enough to get himself a real job. Turns out he was an actual college graduate with a business degree and was dealing in college to make a little money. When he graduated, the money came too easy that he just didn't bother to get a legit job. He wasn't a gangster. He just didn't have that kind of personality, which I suppose is what made him the perfect prey for the actual criminals that broke in that night. We got over what happened, but obviously Daryl still has this big old scar on his shoulder, a reminder of one of the worst nights of our lives, one that'll always be with us no matter where we go, or what we do, or who we become. My family is a small farm here in Kirkwood, upstate New York. We grow a few veggies, keep a few chickens, nothing too spectacular, but it's home and we love it. But a little while ago, back in early 2019, we got woken up by something in the middle of the night that scared the absolute life out of us. We have this big front yard with flower beds and a big lawn, and that's where we keep the chickens and the dog too. So me, my mom, and my dad were all sleeping one night when we're woken up by this huge crash in the front yard. I can hear our dog barking really, really loud and violently before there's like this yelping sound from it and he goes quiet. I walk out into the hallway and see my dad storming out of my parents' bedroom, rushing down the stairs to get his shotgun. Me and my mom were about to follow him outside to get a look at whatever was going on, but he yells at us to call the cops, stay inside, and not follow him under any circumstances. My dad grabs the phone and I rush back into my bedroom to watch from the window. As soon as I look out, I see this car that's smashed through the fence of our yard and torn up a section of our lawn. It's obviously really dark out and the car's headlights are only lighting up a section of our yard, so I can't really see much outside of the beams. But I do see something that absolutely breaks my heart. It's our dog, lying on the front lawn, not moving at all. He looked really hurt. Something had really messed him up. But given that he was barking after the actual smash of the car, it couldn't have been the impact that hurt him so bad. Something else entirely. What I saw next was only because my dad had this little light attached to the end of his shotgun. He starts shining it around the front yard as I hear my mom calling 911 in the hallway, telling them that something horrible had happened at our address and for them to come as quickly as they could. Then my dad shines the shotgun light over towards the chicken coop and I saw something that I continued to see in my nightmares for a long time to come. It was a man, completely naked from head to toe, kneeling among torn-out feathers and broken bodies, and he was sinking his teeth into the flesh of a still-living chicken that he held tight in his grip. Every time he bit into the chicken, it would flap and shake, making the most awful screeching noises as he tore more raw flesh from its body. My dad racked a shell into the chamber and started screaming at the guy to get out of the chicken coop. But the guy barely listens at first, just carries on ripping this big brown chicken apart with his bare hands and teeth. And by the time he does actually start listening to my dad, God, it was horrible. He looked right into the light of the shotgun so that his face was perfectly lit up and he smiled. There was blood and feathers all over his face and chin. He looked monstrous, totally insane, eyes bulging out of their sockets. I think even to this day it's probably the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I started banging on the window and begging my dad to come back inside. I was so scared the guy was going to attack him or something, and if he did, that Dad would shoot him. And I know it's maybe a little lame of me, but I just didn't want to see any of that. I was already distraught from seeing our dog just lying there all lifeless on the lawn, and I know I wouldn't be able to handle it if anything had happened to my dad. Luckily, the guy didn't bother doing anything to my dad at first. I think he was just so blinded by the light of the shotgun that he just sort of stared into the flashlight, hypnotized by it for a few seconds. But he soon rose up off of his knees, that bloody, twitching chicken still in his grip, and started to make a move towards my dad. As soon as he did, the sound of Dad's shotgun rang out as he fired a shot above the guy's head. But the guy hardly flinched. That's when I realized he must have been on some kind of drug or something, maybe meth or PCP or whatever. He didn't seem scared at all by the fact that he'd almost had his head blown off, but it was definitely enough to put him off from straight up attacking my dad. He just carried on smiling though, kneeling back down among the chickens as he carried on ripping them apart. It felt like an hour before I finally saw the red and blue flashing lights of the cop cars coming down the road, but from what I learned later, it was only a couple of minutes before they actually arrived, since they happened to have a unit in the area already down highway patrol. When they arrested the guy, he got really crazy, and they had to actually use their tasers, which had little effect at first, and pepper spray on the guy just to get him on the ground. We later found out that the guy, named John Meny, was actually from Florida, that there had been a manhunt for him, and he'd somehow gotten all the way up to New York State using stolen cars and hiding himself away in trucks. We weren't the only place he'd attacked either, since he actually killed another dog on a different farm, maybe less than 2 miles away from us. That was definitely the most terrifying thing I'd ever woken up to in the middle of the night, by a long shot too. Thankfully, our dog survived. Do you know where the term nightmare comes from? Mare is an old English word meaning demon, or more specifically, incubus, which are said to be male demons who prey on women in the dead of night. The word incubus is derived from the Latin word incubere, which means to lie upon, which leads me to my next point, sleep paralysis. I've suffered from the phenomenon known as sleep paralysis ever since I was a child. For the small number of you who might not know what exactly that is, sleep paralysis is something that can occur while a person is either falling asleep or waking up where they are completely and utterly unable to move or speak. During such episodes, which, thank God, only tend to last a few minutes, a person might suffer hallucinations, both visual and audio, which are absolutely skin-crawlingly terrifying. Like me, for example, I'd say some of the worst moments of my life have been during bouts of sleep paralysis. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and hear this really faint, like hissing or buzzing noise coming from the other side of the bedroom. Sometimes it's just a low-volume static sound, but other times it's like I can hear whispers in the dark. Along with a shadowy black figure that either manifests itself by standing in the corner of the room, or when the episodes are at their worst, sitting on my chest, staring down at me. It used to traumatize me as a child. I really did think it was some kind of ghost or demonic force that was visiting me during the night. Having such terrible bouts of paralysis obviously caused me to lose sleep, and it got so bad that I'd actually be straight up terrified of falling asleep in general. This just exacerbated my condition, as sleep paralysis can become more frequent and potent while sleep deprived. It got to the point where at around 13 years old, I began to become so intensely depressed that I actually contemplated taking my own life. At the time I was suffering, there had been no major drug trials to find something to actually treat sleep paralysis, only secondary treatment plans that focused on antidepressants to treat the residual effects of the condition. My parents weren't willing to just dope me up at such an early age, so the focus for me in particular came in the form of education on what exactly was happening to me. I was taught to understand and get a handle on what the doctors called the catastrophic cognitions that are brought on by the bouts of paralysis. And once I actually understood what was happening to me and why it was happening to me, the episodes got a little easier to deal. Then, after about 6 months of going to a sleep therapist, not only did we manage to reduce the frequency and intensity of the episodes, but when they did actually occur, they were much more easier to deal with. And so it went, for years on years, until my condition was just something I learned to live with. My friends were aware of it. My boyfriends accepted it, comforting me where and when they could. Life with sleep paralysis wasn't so bad in the end. That was until last year, when it contributed to one of the most painfully terrifying experiences of my entire life. At first, it was a night like any other. Well, aside from the obvious episode. I had just moved into a new apartment, which meant I wasn't getting the best sleep possible. Little side note, when you first sleep somewhere new, half your brain actually stays awake. It's some kind of evolutionary benefit type of deal, supposed to keep you safe from saber-toothed tigers or whatever other dangers our primeval ancestors used to face. But no doubt it's something that comes in handy for our more recent predecessors. I'd spoken to one or two of the apartment building's occupants on the day I'd moved in, and one guy had been nice enough to actually help me shift a few of the heavier boxes up the many flights of stairs. He was an older guy, slick-back salt and pepper hair with these small dark eyes, and he told me if I ever needed anything, to call up to his apartment on the top floor. He seemed like a kind, generous soul, exactly what the world needs more of. So on the night in question, I woke from a light slumber, lying on my back and instantly recognizing that old familiar feeling of tingling and numbness, like a really diluted version of that pins and needles feeling when your foot goes to sleep. I heard that same hissing noise I had become accustomed to hearing, like the sound of leaking gas that seethed with faint ripples, making it almost sound like the whispering of hundreds of voices, invisible people crowding around my bed. And just like when I was a kid, I caught sight of that horrifically familiar black shape out of the corner of my eye. It just hovered in the darkness, a murky shadow silhouetted by the faint glow of orange streetlights on the road outside. I did what I'd trained myself to do over the years, try to control my breathing, letting the mantra, "It'll be over soon, it'll be over soon," just roll around my mind. What I was seeing, what I was hearing, none of it was real. It was all just a waking nightmare, nothing more than that. The child I had been terrified out of her mind by the whispers, by the shapes, but the adult I had grown into could handle it, like it was nothing more than a bad horror movie. But then for the first time in my entire life, for the very first time in all the years I've been suffering from sleep paralysis, I saw that shadowy figure in my peripheral vision actually move. I felt my heart begin to pound in my chest as I lost control of my breaths, watching as it slowly began to creep closer and closer to my bed. It was an entirely new and terrifying experience. I had learned to deal with my condition as it was, but this apparent evolution of the symptoms took me right back to that same terror I felt as a child. I was forced just to lie there, trying and failing to control my thoughts and breathing as the figure halted its steps at the edge of my bed. I hadn't been able to bring myself to actually look directly at it, not until it was so close, and besides that, I only had very minimal control over my facial muscles while my body itself is completely paralyzed. But something about the figure's face seemed strangely familiar to me. The structure and profile sparked something in my memory. Then, in a moment of pure, horrifying recognition, I realized who it was. It was the guy from the top floor, and the one that had helped me move boxes on the day I moved in. And this time there was no warm or friendly look in his eyes, and his lips had curled into a hungry, wolfish grin. This was no hallucination. He was real, and he was actually standing over me, staring down at my paralyzed body. The moment after he reached down and peeled back the bed sheets to look at me, I clamped my eyes shut. I knew I wouldn't be able to feel what he was about to do, but I also knew I didn't want to have to see it either. The episode would be over in a minute or two tops, and then I would be able to do something about it. What exactly that was, I wasn't sure, but that's the thought that got me through one of the most appallingly traumatic few moments of my life. By the time I started to sense the feeling returning my limbs and opened my eyes, there was no one in my bedroom anymore. I sat there on my bed for a minute, crying and shaking, second-guessing myself, wondering if that guy really had been there, or if it was just a horrible new evolution of my condition. But my bedroom door was open, and the hall light was on. All things that hadn't been the case when I'd gone to bed that night. I had no idea how someone would have gotten into my apartment, but I had to face the facts as they appeared to me. The guy upstairs had been in my bedroom that night, and although I wasn't sure exactly what he'd done to me, he had done something, and it was something god-awful. The next morning, I called into work to let them know that I was taking a mental health day, but instead of just binging terrible TV shows on my couch with a pint of ice cream like I'd done in the past, I called the police. To put it bluntly, there wasn't a whole lot they could do about what happened. There was very little in the way of actual tangible evidence that there had been any intruders that night. They offered to do the whole assault kit thing, but as much as I wasn't entirely sure what they'd done, I was almost certain that they hadn't done that. I have to make it clear that as much as they couldn't help, the police officer I was put in touch with was extremely nice and suggested a bunch of different things to try and catch the guy, including installing what amounted to a nanny cam in my bedroom. But I opted for another one of her suggestions, which involved just getting out of that apartment block. Luckily, I had a close friend living nearby that offered to let me stay at their place until I could save up the money for a new flat deposit. They were only living in a small studio, and living there with them in such confined quarters did get to us after a while, but I'll always be eternally grateful for the help they gave me during such a horrific time in my life. I think the only thing that really haunts me about the whole thing, aside from the actual memories of that night, are the fact that the guy who was in my room is, as far as I know, still free to walk among us. It's knowing that he still has the capacity to do something like that again, and I pray that no one else has to go through what I did. The scariest thing that ever happened to me in the middle of the night is also something that I thought was going to end in me losing my life. I've read a few of those scary middle-of-the-night type stories and comments that, as much as they've been creepy, have ended with people just rolling over and going back to sleep. A nightmare, a wild animal banging on their window, that sort of thing. No offense intended, I'm sure those things scare the life out of them, but it's obvious that they weren't in fear for their lives. So, anyway, without further ado, this is the story of one of the worst nights of my life. So, on the night in question, I woke up at about 3 a.m. feeling really bad. It took me a moment to work out just what was wrong with me, but I quickly realized that I had this intense burning sensation in my abdomen, like just to the right of my belly button. I was sweating so much my sheets were soaked, and as I rolled out of bed to turn the lights on, my heart rate went through the freaking roof. The muscle cramps were so bad that I was almost bent doubled over as I headed off into the bathroom to get some Tylenol. I mean, they were so bad that at first I thought my appendix might have burst, which, as some of you might well know, can be pretty serious. I stagger into the little kitchen of the apartment I was living in at the time to get a glass of water since I've never been able to dry swallow pills. Then I just sat there at the kitchen table for what seemed like a long time, until it got to the point where I was seriously considering just calling 911 and getting myself into an ambulance. I knew it would be a couple of grand just to get one over to my apartment, but there was no way I'd be able to drive out to the hospital with the pain as bad as it was. I'd crash my car and get myself killed long before whatever mysterious ailment I had managed to finish me off. Screw it, I eventually thought, and stumbled back in my bedroom to grab my phone to dial 911. As I'm online with the dispatcher describing exactly how bad the searing pain in my abdomen was, I found I just couldn't stand up anymore. So I sat back down on my bed as I'm grimacing in pain. My sheets were bundled up under my butt, and I know it sounds kind of dumb, but any kind of discomfort was just made utterly unbearable by the pain I was in. So I sit up and pull them out from under me, tossing them up near my pillows so I could just level myself out on the mattress. That's when I saw it. Lying on my mattress, all squished up and gooey from being crushed, was the biggest black widow spider I'd ever seen. My heart was already racing and I was sweating bullets, but seeing that thing sent me into an absolute panic. I pulled my shirt up and saw a bunch of that same spider's goo drying on my stomach, along with 2 telltale little holes where the spider had bitten me. I genuinely thought I was going to die if the ambulance didn't get there in time. I knew next to nothing about venomous spiders at the time, and I blurted out the revelation to the 911 operator, stammering about how something had bitten me and for the ambulance crew to please hurry. They did what they could for me, trying to keep me calm, but I was full-on hyperventilating by that point, convinced that my life was in grave danger. Now, long story short, as incredibly painful and distressing as it was, one of the paramedics reassured me that fatalities from Black Widow's spider bites are extremely rare, and even though they'd been treating me with antivenom, along with some serious doses of painkillers and anti-inflammatories, I was almost certainly going to be okay. The relief was palpable. I just remember crying my eyes out in the ambulance and all the exhaustion and pain and relief just pouring out of me as I thanked the paramedics before they wheeled me into the emergency room. It was a few hours for me to get the proper treatment and evaluation, but I was discharged soon after so I could catch a taxi back to my apartment. So, that's my story. And if anyone can learn anything from this, about how not to fly into a fit of panic when they're bitten by a black widow spider, then I suppose I might have earned myself a little good karma. Like obviously getting yourself the proper treatment as soon as possible, but don't be fooled by those intimidating red and black appearances and that horror movie name. Black widows are a lot of bark, but a distinctly non-fatal bite. I grew up in a place called Hemel Hempstead here in the UK. It's a fairly small but old town just over 20 miles outside of London. Nothing much happens there. It's honestly a pretty boring place. But it currently wasn't boring in December of 2005. In fact, something happened down there that I don't think anyone who was around for it will ever forget. So picture the scene. It's almost Christmas for 17-year-old me. Decorations are going up all over town. Christmas songs are starting to be getting played on the radio, and with every day that passes, the town center is getting busier and busier with everyone doing all their Christmas shopping. Saturday evening of the 10th of December was one pretty much like any other. I played a lot of football in the park with my mates in the afternoon, then got home just after dark to tuck into the Indian takeaway that my dad brought home pretty much every Saturday, a fond little tradition we had going at the time. Mom and Dad stayed up quite late, just watching telly and working their way through a bottle of wine while I stayed up in my room playing PC games until about 2 a.m. the next morning. I was absolutely exhausted by the time it came to climb into bed, and I drifted off fairly quickly, having planned on sleeping until late Sunday morning. But just a few hours later, I found myself jolted awake by something horrifically loud. I rolled over in a fright, and because it was still dark at the time of the morning, it took me a minute to work out that there was broken glass all over my bed and all over my carpet. The windows in my bedroom being completely and utterly smashed in, and there was this deep rumbling sound grumbling all over the neighborhood outside. I had no idea what was going on, but I remember my first thought being that our house was being violently burgled or something, so I threw my trainers on to not cut my feet on any of the broken glass before getting up to run into my mom and dad's room. And that's when I caught a glimpse of the open windows. In the distance, this huge bright orange fireball was rising up into the sky. I mean, it was absolutely massive and looked almost identical to the kind you see after a nuclear explosion. I was absolutely horrified, like I legitimately thought someone had dropped a bomb on the UK, and 1,000 terrified thoughts rushed through my head all at once, picturing the nuclear apocalypse that would inevitably follow. The entire world was about to be thrown into a horrific atomic dark age, and I believed that I was witnessing the first moments of it. Right then, my dad came running into my room to check if I was okay, and when he saw that fireball and uttered a shell-shocked, "Oh my God," he had a fear in his eyes that I'd never seen before or since. We both watched for a moment as fires engulfed a huge spot on the horizon, and big patches of the starry night sky were being totally blocked out by smoke. Then we saw and heard more explosions, flashes of orange on the horizon, and these weren't nearly as big as the first one. So at the time, I was obsessed with this game called Fallout 2. It was a bit of a cult hit at the time. Not all that many people have heard of it, unlike now when all the other games have meant that pretty much every gamer on every platform is familiar with the Fallout universe and all its entails. I absolutely love Fallout 2. I still do, because it completely captured my imagination and filled me with a morbid fascination with all things atomic warfare related. It sounds a bit daft in retrospect, and maybe it was just how tired and frightened I was, but I really did think it was the end. But Dad was quick to reassure me, in a pretty grim way to be honest. "It can't be a nuclear bomb," he said, still sounding pretty shaken. "I mean, if it was, we'd all be dead, son. quick as a flash. Besides, there's an oil storage place out those ways, isn't there? It's gotta be that. And he was dead right, because the morning of the 11th of December 2005 was the day the Hertfordshire oil storage terminal blew up in what became known as the Buncefield explosion. From what I read later, the first explosion, the one that blew our windows out, happened just after 6 a.m., and firefighters were on the scene less than 10 minutes later. It was all because of a fuel leak, apparently, quite a slow one that caused a vapor cloud that was eventually ignited by something, causing a gigantic boom that was apparently the biggest explosion in Europe since the end of World War II. I know the bang had smashed out windows for miles and all that, which actually still boggles my mind to this day, but you really didn't get a sense of the destruction until the sun had risen a little bit, and you saw the cloud of smoke rising from the oil terminal. It was gargantuan, and I know I can't get it across in words. Like, if you get a chance, Google it and you'll see what I mean. It blocked out half the bloody sky, like I've only seen things that big in freaking Godzilla movies and stuff. It was so massive it was like your brain just couldn't even compute the size of it. I really haven't seen anything as big before or since. About 2 hours after the explosion, we got a knock on the front door from the police, telling us and our neighbors that we had to evacuate our houses for safety reasons. Not only was there broken glass everywhere, but apparently local authorities were extremely concerned that the wind might change and that the huge smoke cloud would engulf the area, which, as you can imagine, would have been really bad news for us. We ended up staying in a hotel for a few days, and as a weird kind of silver lining, we got a few days off of school since a lot of similar damage was done to the buildings there, and they had to get structural engineers in to give the place a look over before they announced it was safe. I'm not traumatized by what happened that morning, but all in all, the Buncefield explosion was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and one that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. Okay, so we're going back a few years here to when I first moved out of my mom and dad's house and into my first ever apartment. It wasn't the most luxurious place to live, not by a long shot. A lot of stuff needed fixing up, and the plumbing was terrible, and the bed springs creaked with every little movement I'd make at night. But it was cheap, really cheap, and for someone like me with a low-paying service job, it gave me a lot of extra disposable income that I could spend and save. So about a month or so into living in that little apartment, the ceiling fan in my bedroom started making these weird clicking noises. I could put up with some sketchy plumbing as long as the shower and the toilet flush still worked, but this was the middle of the summer in Miami, and not beachside either. So if that thing decided to stop working, trying to get to sleep would be pretty unbearable. I called the landlord, let him know the problem. He said that he'd send a repair guy out as soon as he could. But then the guy turned up and checked the ceiling fan out. He basically said, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just old. And young, dumb me just trusted that he was right. So one night, it's extra hot and humid, so I turned the ceiling fan up to the settings just before full blast before climbing into bed. I can hear it making those clicking sounds like extra loud as I'm drifting off, but I put on a podcast on my phone to kind of drown it out and drift off. Besides, rhythmic sounds like that aren't the worst thing, and a lot of people like myself find that they can actually get to sleep like that. I mean, some people even use an actual metronome to kind of hypnotize themselves into getting to sleep. But it might have been a few hours later when I woke up to a whining, whirring sound coming from above me. I couldn't quite work out where it was coming from at first, and in my tired state I rolled over and had to flick on the bedside lamp before I could figure out what exactly was making that noise. It was the ceiling fan. And right when I look up, I see how it's spinning all loose on its moorings, how it's looking increasingly out of control. Then all of a sudden, it cracks out of the actual ceiling and comes hurtling down towards me, right towards my face, while spinning ridiculously fast. I thought that was it right there, how that ceiling fan was about to take my head clean off, or at least do so much damage to me that I'd bleed to death right there in my bed. It's so weird when I look back at it, like they say the time slows down in situations like that, and in a sense they're right. It obviously didn't happen in slow motion, but I remember such bizarre details when I look back at it. How I noticed a little puff of plaster as soon as the fan came loose. How I noticed how dusty the old thing was as it got closer and bigger, plunging towards my face. Instinctually, I lay back down and tried to cover my face, letting out a screech of fear as I did so, then just kind of waiting for the pain to hit. But right as it was about to smash into my face, right as it was about to rip me up beyond all recognition, whatever electrical wire that it was hooked up to suddenly grew taut and held it right there in the air above me, stopping it from crashing into me. All that hit me was a little of the ceiling plaster and some dust, and I remember that weird anticlimactic feeling to this day, like it's burned into my memory. But it wasn't quite over there. It was still spinning really, really fast, and because it wasn't locked into the ceiling anymore, it was like swaying back and forth in the air above me, maybe only like few inches above my body, and I wasn't sure how long it was going to hold. I had to really, really carefully slide off of my bed, still terrified that the spinning blades were going to cut me up. It was painstaking. Move too quick and I might clip my head or a knee on the fan. Move too slow and I might just still be under it when the thing fell down on top of me. I made it out from under that thing and rushed towards the wall-mounted control unit before turning it off completely. I had knocks on my door from neighbors soon after who thought that there had been a home invasion or something. Every single one of them gasped when they saw just how close I'd been to being sliced and diced by the freaking ceiling fan. I slept on my couch that night, or rather, tried to sleep. I was still pumped with adrenaline from having the whole thing happen. The next morning, if you can believe it, the landlord actually blamed me for what had happened, flicking back and forth between telling me that I had it spinning too fast to not properly communicating the problem to the lazy repair guy who'd come out to check on it. It was absolutely outrageous, and only when I'd threatened civil litigation did he actually relent and agree to a rent reduction for the next few months to apologize. He ended up having a whole new ceiling fan installed, but you can bet your bottom I rearranged my bedroom so that my bed wasn't underneath that fan anymore. Sure, it was a little less comfortable getting to sleep during the summer, but after what happened that night, I just wasn't about to risk it. Let's just say I had a wear complex about ceiling fans ever since, and I never ever set them to full blast, no matter how hot it is. I live here in Detroit with my cat named Bruce. He's honestly my whole world and I love him to pieces, and that's down to much more than him just being a sweetie pie. So now I'll tell you the story of why my cat means the absolute world to me, and when I'm done, you'll see how I'm not just some crazy cat lady and understand exactly how much I owe to my little guy. So one night, a couple of years back, Bruce woke me up by pawing at my face. Now this wasn't something entirely new. Sometimes he'd wake me up during the mad half hour that most cats seem to enjoy in the middle of the night, jumping up on the shelves in the TV room and knocking things over. This is why we can't have nice things, Bruce. This was definitely the first time he'd ever gotten up onto my bed and actually pawed at my face, and since I had work early the next morning, I was not pleased. So I give him a gentle shove off of my bed. I know it sounds mean, but he can take it, and tell him what a rude young man he was being waking me up like that before I roll over and drift off back to sleep. But then he does it again, climbs up onto my bed and starts pawing at my face again while doing these high-pitched little scream meows. Now, I always feed Bruce before I go to bed, to stop this exact kind of thing from happening, so I politely remind my little guy that he does in fact have food in his bowl and that if he ate it all, I'm not giving him any more. The last thing I wanted was for him to be one of those fat cats with their tummy fur rubbing against the ground whenever he walked anywhere. So again, I pushed him off the bed, tell him to behave, and try to get back to sleep. I suppose you can imagine what happened next, right? Yep. Right as I'm about to drift off, he does it again. I'm pretty furious by this point. I am in no mood whatsoever to have my sleep disturbed over and over again, so I get up, scoop him into my arms, and walk him into the other room with the intention of putting his water and food in there and leaving him until morning with a few of his toys. But right as I get into the hallway of my apartment, I smell it. Gas. There was an actual freaking gas leak in my kitchen. Not a huge amount had leaked, but over the course of the night it might have well have filled up my kitchen and the hallway. Not to mention the fact that I'm a smoker. I love a cigarette with my morning coffee, so there's every chance that if that gas didn't actually suffocate me during the night, I'd have gotten up the next morning, lit up my morning smoke, then boom, I'd be a goner. I'm pretty sure Bruce saved my life that night. If it wasn't for him pawing at my face over and over again, there's a pretty good chance I might not be here to tell you guys this little story of mine. So I'm guessing you can all see why I love my little hero so much. I mean, I love cats. I've always adored the little furballs, way more than dogs too, no offense to them. But Bruce is probably the reason I'm actually still alive right now. And for that, I will always be grateful. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell and be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from my community and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I love lasagna.